Margaret Williams woke up at 5 in the morning, just like she had every day for the past 3 years. The alarm clock beside her small bed in the basement room buzzed quietly. She quickly turned it off, not wanting to wake anyone in the big house above her. At 45 years old, Margaret had learned to move like a ghost through the Harrison mansion. Her worn slippers made no sound on the marble floors as she began her daily routine. First, she would start the coffee machine in the kitchen. Then she would check if any dishes were left in the sink from the night before. Mrs. Harrison often had her friends over for wine, and they never cleaned up after themselves. Margaret had worked for rich families before, but the Harrisons were different. Not in a good way. Mrs. Harrison spoke to her like she was invisible most days. When she did speak, it was usually to complain about something. The bathroom wasn't clean enough. The flowers in the vase were not arranged properly. The dinner party last week had one small problem, and somehow it was all Margaret's fault. But Margaret needed this job. Her daughter Jessica was 17 and wanted to go to college. The tuition money had to come from somewhere, and jobs that paid well were hard to find for someone like Margaret. She had no college degree, no special skills that rich people cared about. What she did have was 25 years of experience taking care of homes and families. The Harrison house was enormous. 12 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, a library that no one ever used, and a dining room table that could seat 20 people. Most days it felt empty and cold, even with all the expensive furniture and fancy decorations. Mr. Harrison was hardly ever home. He owned several companies and traveled constantly. When he was home, he stayed in his office making phone calls or working on his computer. He barely noticed Margaret, which was actually a relief. Mrs. Harrison's attention was never pleasant. Then, there was little Timothy. He was 5 years old with bright blue eyes and messy brown hair that never stayed combed for long. Timothy was the only person in the house who smiled at Margaret every day. He would run up to her when she was dusting the living room and tell her about his dreams or ask her questions about everything. Mrs. Harrison didn't like Timothy talking to Margaret too much. She would pull him away and remind him that Margaret was there to work, not to chat. But when Mrs. Harrison wasn't around, Timothy would find Margaret anyway. He was lonely in that big house, just like she was. Margaret often thought about her own daughter at Timothy's age. Jessica had been full of energy and questions, too. But Margaret had been working 2 jobs back then, trying to keep their small apartment and put food on the table. She missed a lot of Jessica's childhood because she was always working. Now Jessica was almost grown up, and Margaret was taking care of someone else's child instead. On this particular Tuesday morning, something felt different. Margaret noticed it right away when she went to wake Timothy up for breakfast. Usually he would jump out of bed as soon as she opened his door. He loved breakfast time because Margaret would make him pancakes shaped like animals while Mrs. Harrison was still sleeping. But today, Timothy didn't move when she called his name. Margaret walked closer to his bed and saw that his face was red and sweaty. She touched his forehead with the back of her hand, the way her own mother had taught her years ago. Timothy was burning up with fever. Margaret's heart started beating faster. She had raised Jessica through plenty of fevers and colds, but this felt different. Timothy's breathing sounded heavy and difficult. When she gently shook his shoulder, he opened his eyes but seemed confused and tired. Mrs. Harrison was still asleep, and Margaret knew better than to wake her up early. Mrs. Harrison valued her beauty sleep more than almost anything else. But Timothy needed help, and Margaret couldn't just leave him like this. She went to the kitchen and got a cool, damp cloth. Back in Timothy's room, she placed it on his forehead and watched as he seemed to relax a little. She had done this same thing for Jessica many times when she was small. An hour later, Mrs. Harrison finally came downstairs. She was already dressed for her morning yoga class and checking messages on her phone. Margaret approached her carefully. "Excuse me, Mrs. Harrison. Timothy has a fever this morning. I think maybe we should call the doctor." Mrs. Harrison looked annoyed at being interrupted. She glanced toward the stairs but didn't go up to check on her son. "Children get fevers all the time, Margaret. It's probably nothing serious. Just give him some medicine and let him rest. I have yoga, then lunch with the charity committee, and tonight is the museum fundraiser." Margaret felt a knot forming in her stomach. "But Mrs. Harrison, he's really hot, and his breathing sounds strange." "Margaret, I don't have time for this drama today. Timothy is fine. Children are stronger than you think. Just do your job and stop worrying about things that aren't your concern." Mrs. Harrison grabbed her yoga mat and left through the front door. Margaret stood in the empty kitchen, feeling helpless and angry at the same time. She had seen sick children before. Timothy was not fine. For the rest of the morning, Margaret kept checking on Timothy every 30 minutes. His fever wasn't going down, even with the children's medicine from the bathroom cabinet. He was drinking small sips of water when she asked him to, but he couldn't eat anything. By afternoon, Timothy's breathing was getting worse. Margaret could hear a rattling sound when he breathed, and it scared her. She had heard that sound before, when her neighbor's baby had pneumonia years ago. Mrs. Harrison came home around 4 o'clock, talking loudly on her phone about flower arrangements for the fundraiser. She went straight to her room to get ready for the evening event. Margaret waited until she finished her call, then knocked on her bedroom door. "Mrs. Harrison, I'm really worried about Timothy. His fever is higher now and he's having trouble breathing. I think we need to take him to the hospital." Mrs. Harrison was applying makeup at her vanity mirror. She didn't turn around to look at Margaret. "Margaret, you're being dramatic. Timothy probably just has a little cold. I cannot miss tonight's fundraiser. I'm being honored for my charity work, and the mayor will be there. Just keep giving him medicine and let him sleep." "But, Mrs. Harrison, that's enough, Margaret. I don't want to hear another word about this. Timothy will be fine by tomorrow. Children recover quickly from these things. Now, I need you to iron my black dress for tonight and make sure the silver earrings are polished." Margaret felt like screaming, but she knew it wouldn't help. Mrs. Harrison had made up her mind. Margaret was just the help, and her opinion didn't matter. That evening, after Mrs. Harrison left for her fancy party, Margaret sat in Timothy's room and made a decision that would change everything. She moved a comfortable chair next to his bed and settled in for the night. Timothy was getting worse, not better, and she wasn't going to leave him alone. Margaret had been taking care of other people's children for years, but she had never felt as protective as she did right now. Timothy reminded her so much of Jessica at that age. He was innocent and sweet, and he trusted the adults around him to keep him safe. As the night went on, Margaret did everything she could think of to help Timothy feel better. She kept the cool cloths on his forehead, helped him sip water, and sang quiet songs that used to comfort Jessica when she was sick. But Timothy's fever kept climbing, and his breathing kept getting more difficult. Around midnight, Margaret made another decision. She called the family doctor even though she knew Mrs. Harrison would be furious. Dr. Peterson had been taking care of the Harrison family for years, and he knew Timothy well. When Dr. Peterson arrived an hour later, he took one look at Timothy and confirmed Margaret's worst fears. Timothy had pneumonia, and it was serious. He needed immediate medical attention and constant monitoring. "This child should have been brought to the hospital hours ago," Dr. Peterson told Margaret quietly. "His condition is critical. If you hadn't called me when you did, we might have been too late." Margaret felt tears in her eyes as she realized how close they had come to losing Timothy. She had trusted her instincts, and those instincts had probably saved his life. Dr. Peterson gave Timothy medicine and showed Margaret how to monitor his breathing and temperature throughout the night. He promised to return first thing in the morning to check on the boy again. As Margaret settled back into the chair beside Timothy's bed, she knew there would be consequences for her actions. Mrs. Harrison would be angry about the doctor visit. She might even fire Margaret for going against her orders. But as she watched Timothy's small chest rise and fall with each difficult breath, Margaret knew she had made the right choice. Sometimes doing the right thing meant risking everything else. Margaret had been awake for almost 72 hours straight. Her eyes were red and tired, but she couldn't bring herself to leave Timothy's side. The little boy had gotten worse before he started getting better. And there were moments during those 3 long days when Margaret thought she might lose him. On the first night, Timothy's fever had climbed so high that Margaret had to strip off his pajamas and cover him with just a thin sheet. She spent hours placing cool washcloths on his forehead, arms, and chest, changing them every few minutes as they warmed up from his burning skin. His breathing was so labored that she could hear it from across the room. Dr. Peterson had come, back early the next morning, just as he promised. He brought stronger medicine and an oxygen tank to help Timothy breathe easier. Margaret watched carefully as the doctor showed her how to monitor Timothy's oxygen levels and when to be worried. "You're doing an excellent job," Dr. Peterson told Margaret quietly. "This boy is lucky to have someone who cares so much about him." Mrs. Harrison had returned from her fundraiser that morning in a terrible mood. The mayor had apparently not shown up, and her charity award ceremony had been postponed. She was angry about everything, and when she saw the doctor's car in the driveway, her anger turned to rage. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, storming into Timothy's room where Margaret was adjusting his oxygen mask. "I specifically told you not to call the doctor. Timothy just has a simple cold." Dr. Peterson stood up from where he had been checking Timothy's chest with his stethoscope. His face was serious and professional, but Margaret could see the anger in his eyes. "Mrs. Harrison, your son has pneumonia. This is a serious condition that could have been life-threatening if Margaret hadn't acted when she did. Timothy needs round-the-clock care for the next several days." Mrs. Harrison's face turned red, but she couldn't argue with the doctor. Instead, she turned her anger toward Margaret. "This is completely unacceptable." "Margaret, you deliberately disobeyed my direct orders. When my husband returns from his business trip, we will be discussing your employment here." Margaret felt her heart sink, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Harrison, but Timothy needed help. I couldn't just watch him get sicker." "You are the housekeeper, not the mother. You don't make medical decisions in this house." Dr. Peterson cleared his throat. "Actually, Mrs. Harrison, Margaret made exactly the right decisions. If she had waited any longer to call me, Timothy might have needed to be hospitalized. Her quick thinking and excellent care have kept him stable." Mrs. Harrison left the room without another word, but Margaret knew she was in serious trouble. She tried not to think about what would happen when Mr. Harrison came home. Instead, she focused on Timothy, who was slowly starting to respond to the medication. By the second day, Timothy was awake for longer periods. He couldn't talk much because of the oxygen mask. but he would squeeze Margaret's hand when she asked if he was feeling a little better. Margaret had moved a small cot into his room so she could sleep nearby and wake up immediately if he needed anything. She had created a careful schedule for Timothy's medicine, checking his temperature every 2 hours and writing everything down in a notebook. Dr. Peterson had taught her how to listen to Timothy's breathing and what sounds to worry about. Margaret had always been good at taking care of sick children, but she had never had to handle anything this serious before. Mrs. Harrison avoided Timothy's room for most of those 2 days. She had her regular activities, tennis lessons, shopping, trips, and lunch dates with her friends. A few times, Margaret heard her on the phone telling people that Timothy had a little bug and would be fine soon. She never mentioned how sick he had really been. On the 3rd day, Timothy's fever finally broke. When Margaret checked his temperature that morning, it was almost normal for the first time since he had gotten sick. His breathing was easier, too, and Dr. Peterson said they could remove the oxygen mask for a few hours to see how he did on his own. Margaret was so relieved that she started crying right there in Timothy's room. All the fear and exhaustion from the past 3 days hit her at once. Timothy looked at her with his big blue eyes and tried to smile. "Are you sad, Margaret?" he whispered. His voice was scratchy from being sick, but it was the most beautiful sound Margaret had heard in days. "No, sweetheart," she said, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "I'm happy. You're getting better. Were you taking care of me the whole time?" "Yes, I was right here with you." Timothy reached out his small hand and touched Margaret's cheek. "Thank you for not leaving me alone." Margaret had to turn away so Timothy wouldn't see her cry again. In that moment, she realized that even if Mrs. Harrison fired her, even if she had to start all over again looking for a new job, she would make the same choice. Timothy was just a little boy who needed someone to care about him, and Margaret couldn't have done anything else. That afternoon, Margaret heard a car door slam in the driveway. She looked out Timothy's window and saw Mr. Harrison getting out of a black taxi, pulling his suitcase behind him. He looked tired and stressed, probably from traveling all night to get home early from his business trip. Margaret's stomach twisted with worry. Mrs. Harrison had probably called him and told him about the doctor visits and how Margaret had disobeyed orders. Margaret had never had a real conversation with Mr. Harrison in 3 years of working for his family. He was always polite but distant, treating her like part of the furniture. She could hear voices downstairs, Mrs. Harrison's high, angry tone, and Mr. Harrison's deeper voice asking questions. Margaret couldn't make out the words, but she could tell the conversation was about her and Timothy. 20 minutes later, Margaret heard footsteps on the stairs. Heavy, determined footsteps that were definitely Mr. Harrison's. Margaret quickly checked to make sure Timothy was comfortable and that his medicine chart was neat and organized. She wanted everything to look professional when Mr. Harrison came to fire her. The footsteps stopped outside Timothy's door. Margaret held her breath, waiting for the knock or for the door to open. But for a long moment, nothing happened. Then she heard something unexpected. The sound of humming. Margaret had been humming softly to Timothy for the past 3 days whenever he seemed restless or scared. It was something she used to do for Jessica when she was little, and it seemed to comfort Timothy too. She had been humming the same gentle tune just a few minutes ago. The door opened slowly, and Mr. Harrison stepped into the room. Margaret stood up from her chair beside Timothy's bed, preparing herself for the worst conversation of her life. But Mr. Harrison didn't look angry. He looked surprised and something else that Margaret couldn't quite identify. His eyes moved from Margaret to Timothy, who was sleeping peacefully with normal, easy breathing for the first time in days. Then his eyes moved to the notebook where Margaret had been tracking Timothy's temperature and medicine schedule. He saw the small cot where Margaret had been sleeping, the stack of clean washcloths, and the careful organization of everything Timothy needed. "How long have you been in here?" Mr. Harrison asked quietly. Margaret's voice came out as barely a whisper. 3 days, sir, since Timothy got sick." "You've been sleeping in here for 3 days?" "Yes, sir. Dr. Peterson said Timothy needed constant monitoring, and I wanted to make sure he was safe." Mr. Harrison walked closer to Timothy's bed and looked down at his son. Timothy's color was almost back to normal, and his breathing was steady and peaceful. Mr. Harrison reached out and gently touched Timothy's forehead, checking for fever the same way Margaret had been doing. "Dr. Peterson called me this morning," Mr. Harrison said, still looking at Timothy. "He told me what happened. He said Timothy had pneumonia and that it could have been very serious." Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "He also told me that you probably saved Timothy's life." The words hung in the air between them. Margaret had expected anger, accusations, and immediate termination. She had not expected this quiet, thoughtful conversation. Mr. Harrison turned to look at Margaret directly for the first time. "My wife tells me she instructed you not to call the doctor." Margaret felt her heart pounding. "Yes, sir. But Timothy was so sick, and I was scared. I know I should have listened to Mrs. Harrison, but I couldn't just watch him suffer." "You defied her direct orders." "Yes, sir." Mr. Harrison was quiet for a long moment, looking back and forth between Margaret and his sleeping son. When he spoke again, his voice was different, softer and more serious than Margaret had ever heard it. "Margaret, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." Margaret nodded, bracing herself. "If you had to make the same choice again, knowing that you might lose your job, what would you do?" Margaret didn't hesitate. "I would call the doctor again, sir. Timothy needed help, and that was more important than anything else." Mr. Harrison stared at her for a long moment. Then he did something that shocked Margaret completely. He smiled. Mr. Harrison's smile caught Margaret completely off guard. In 3 years of working for his family, she had never seen him smile at her. She wasn't even sure what it meant. "Margaret, I want you to sit down for a minute," he said, gesturing to the chair beside Timothy's bed. "We need to talk." Margaret's legs felt shaky as she sat down. She had been standing and walking for 3 days straight, running on nothing but worry and determination. Now that the immediate crisis was over, exhaustion was hitting her like a wave. Mr. Harrison pulled another chair closer and sat down facing her. This was the first time in 3 years that they had ever sat in the same room together, let alone had a real conversation. "Tell me exactly what happened," he said. "From the beginning." Margaret took a deep breath and started talking. She told him about finding Timothy with a fever on Tuesday morning, about Mrs. Harrison's reaction, about watching Timothy get sicker throughout the day. She explained how she had made the decision to call Dr. Peterson in the middle of the night, and how she had been taking care of Timothy ever since. Mr. Harrison listened without interrupting. His face was serious but not angry. When Margaret finished talking, he was quiet for a long moment. "Margaret, do you have children of your own?" "Yes, sir. I have a daughter, Jessica. She's 17. And when Jessica was Timothy's age, if she had been this sick, what would you have done?" Margaret thought about those early years when Jessica was small and Margaret was working 2 jobs just to keep them afloat. I would have taken her to the hospital immediately, sir, even if I had to miss work and lose pay. Even if someone in authority told you not to? Yes, sir. When a child is sick like that, nothing else matters. Mr. Harrison nodded slowly. That's exactly what I thought you would say. Margaret wasn't sure what that meant, but something in his tone made her feel a little less scared. Margaret, I want you to know something. I spoke with Dr. Peterson for a long time this morning. He told me that Timothy's pneumonia was severe enough that he could have died if you hadn't acted when you did. He said your care over the past 3 days was better than what Timothy would have received in many hospitals. Margaret felt tears starting to form in her eyes again. I just did what any mother would do, sir. That's exactly my point, Mr. Harrison said. You treated my son like he was your own child. You put his well-being above your job, above your own comfort, above everything else. Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Margaret, I owe you an apology. Actually, I owe you much. More than that. This was not at all what Margaret had expected. Sir? I have been a terrible father, Mr. Harrison said quietly. And my wife has been a terrible mother. We have been so busy with our businesses and our social lives that we forgot the most important thing, taking care of our son. Margaret wanted to disagree, to say something polite, but she couldn't find the words. For 3 years you have been working in our house, and I barely knew your name. I treated you like you were invisible. Meanwhile, you were the only person in this house who truly cared about Timothy's well-being. Mr. Harrison stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the large backyard where Timothy liked to play. Do you know how I found out Timothy was sick? Dr. Peterson called me in London and told me I needed to come home immediately because my son almost died. My son almost died, and I wasn't even here. Margaret could hear the pain in his voice. Have spent the last 12 hours on airplanes thinking about what kind of man I am, what kind of father I am. And I realized something, Margaret. You have been more of a parent to Timothy than I have ever been. Mr. Harrison turned back to face Margaret. My wife is downstairs right now waiting for me to fire you. She's angry that you disobeyed her orders. She wants you gone immediately. Margaret's heart sank. So this was it after all. But I'm not going to fire you, Margaret. I'm going to do something that I should have done a long time ago. Before Margaret could ask what he meant, they heard voices downstairs. Mrs. Harrison was talking to someone, probably her sister Patricia, who often came over for afternoon tea and gossip. Perfect timing, Mr. Harrison said. Margaret, I want you to come downstairs with me. There are some people I want you to meet. Margaret was confused, but she followed Mr. Harrison out of Timothy's room and down the grand staircase. In the living room, she saw Mrs. Harrison sitting with Patricia and 2 other women from their social circle. They were drinking tea from the expensive china and talking in low, urgent voices. When Mrs. Harrison saw Margaret, her face immediately turned cold. Robert, why is she down here? I thought you were going to handle this situation. I am handling it, Mr. Harrison said calmly. Ladies, I'm glad you're all here. I have an announcement to make. The women looked curious and slightly excited. In their social circle, announcements usually meant parties, charity events, or gossip about other families. As you all know, Timothy has been very sick for the past few days, Mr. Harrison began. Oh, just a little cold, Mrs. Harrison interrupted quickly. Children get these things all the time. No, Mr. Harrison said firmly. Timothy had pneumonia, severe pneumonia. Dr. Peterson told me that without immediate medical attention, Timothy could have died. The women gasped and started murmuring to each other. Patricia put her hand over her heart dramatically. The person who saved my son's life, Mr. Harrison continued, is standing right here. Margaret Williams has been taking care of Timothy around the clock for 3 days. She called the doctor against direct orders not to. She slept in his room, monitored his breathing, gave him medicine, and provided the kind of care that most people reserve for their own children. Mrs. Harrison's face was getting redder by the minute. Robert, this is inappropriate. Margaret is the help. She doesn't need to be praised for doing her job. That's where you're wrong, Mr. Harrison said. What Margaret did was far beyond her job. She risked her employment to save our child's life. And that's why I'm making some changes. The room was completely silent now. Even the women who loved gossip were hanging on every word. Margaret Williams is no longer our housekeeper, Mr. Harrison announced. Mrs. Harrison looked triumphant. Well, it's about time. She is now Timothy's official caregiver and a permanent member of this household, Mr. Harrison continued. I am setting up a trust fund in her name, and she will have legal authority to make medical decisions for Timothy when neither my wife nor I are available. The silence in the room was deafening. Margaret felt like the floor was moving under her feet. She couldn't possibly have heard that correctly. Furthermore, Mr. Harrison went on, I am establishing a scholarship foundation in Margaret's honor. It will provide full educational funding for children from families who cannot afford college tuition. Patricia's teacup rattled against her saucer. Mrs. Harrison's mouth was hanging open. Robert, you cannot be serious, Mrs. Harrison finally managed to say. Have you lost your mind? Actually, I think I found it, Mr. Harrison replied. For the first time in years, I'm thinking clearly. Margaret showed me what it means to truly care about someone else. She showed me what love looks like when it's put into action. He turned to face the group of women directly. All of you have children. If your child was dying and someone saved their life, what would you do for that person? None of the women answered. I'll tell you what I'm going to do, Mr. Harrison said. I'm going to make sure Margaret never has to worry about money again. I'm going to make sure her daughter gets the education she deserves. And I'm going to make sure that other families get the help they need, too. Mrs. Harrison stood up abruptly. This is insane, Robert. What will people think? What will our friends say? I don't care what people think, Mr. Harrison said. For too long, I've cared more about what people think than about what's right. Margaret did the right thing when it mattered most. Now it's my turn. He looked at Margaret, who was still trying to process what was happening. Margaret, you saved my son's life. You showed me what real love and dedication look like. From now on, you're not just an employee in this house. You're family. The women in the living room looked like they had seen a ghost. Mrs. Harrison's face had gone from red to pale white, and Margaret, for the first time in 3 days, finally allowed herself to cry tears of relief and joy. The days that followed Mr. Harrison's announcement were unlike anything Margaret had ever experienced. The fancy women in the living room had left that afternoon without finishing their tea, whispering furiously to each other as they walked to their expensive cars. Margaret could see them through the window, making phone calls before they even drove away. Mrs. Harrison had locked herself in her bedroom and refused to come out for dinner. Margaret could hear her on the phone, her voice getting higher and angrier with each conversation. By the next morning, it seemed like everyone in their wealthy neighborhood knew what had happened. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the sudden change in her life. Mr. Harrison had called his lawyer that very evening and started the paperwork to make everything official. Margaret would have her own legal status in the family, a bank account with more money than she had ever seen, and most importantly, the authority to make decisions about Timothy's care. But the changes went far beyond just paperwork. The next morning, Mr. Harrison knocked on Margaret's basement room door with a set of keys. "These are for the guest suite on the second floor," he said, "right next to Timothy's room. I've already had your things moved up there." Margaret stared at the keys in her palm. The guest suite was bigger than the entire apartment she had shared with Jessica for 10 years. It had its own bathroom, a sitting area, and windows that looked out over the garden. "Sir, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything." "Margaret, this is your home now." Timothy was getting stronger every day. By the end of the week, he was back to his usual energetic self, running around the house and asking Margaret 1,000 questions about everything. But something had changed. In him, too. He seemed to understand, even at 5 years old, that Margaret had taken care of him when he was really sick. "Margaret saved my life," he told anyone who would listen. "She stayed with me the whole time and made me feel better." The first real test came when Mrs. Harrison finally emerged from her room. She had clearly been making plans during her days of hiding. She appeared in the kitchen one morning dressed in her most expensive outfit, carrying several shopping bags. "I'm going to stay with my sister for a while," she announced to Margaret and Mr. Harrison, "until this ridiculous situation is resolved." Mr. Harrison was feeding Timothy breakfast and didn't look up from the table. "The situation is resolved, Helen. This is how things are going to be from now on. Robert, you cannot seriously expect me to live in the same house as the help. What will people think? Margaret isn't the help anymore, Helen. She's family. And if you can't accept that, then maybe staying with your sister is a good idea." Mrs. Harrison's face turned red again. "Fine, but don't expect me to come back until you come to your senses." She stormed out of the kitchen, and they heard the front door slam a few minutes later. Timothy looked confused and a little sad, but Mr. Harrison just continued eating his eggs like nothing had happened. "Is Mommy mad at me?" Timothy asked. "No, buddy," Mr. Harrison said gently. "Mommy is just confused right now, but Margaret and I are here to take care of you." Margaret felt her heart break a little for Timothy. Even though Mrs. Harrison had never been a particularly warm mother, she was still Timothy's mom. But Margaret also felt something else. A sense of responsibility and love for this little boy that was deeper than anything she had expected. The real changes started happening in the weeks that followed. Mr. Harrison kept his promise about the scholarship foundation. He hired a team of lawyers and education specialists to set up a program that would help children from low-income families attend college. Margaret was involved in every meeting, helping to decide how the money would be used and which children would receive help. "I want you to be the face of this foundation," Mr. Harrison told Margaret during one of their planning sessions. "You understand what it's like to struggle financially while trying to give your child a better life. You know what these families need." Margaret was nervous about being in charge of so much money and responsibility, but she was also excited. She had always dreamed of helping other families the way she wished someone had helped her when Jessica was younger. The first scholarship recipient was a girl named Carmen, whose mother worked 3 jobs to pay rent for their small apartment. Carmen was brilliant in math and science but couldn't afford to go to college. When Margaret called to tell Carmen's mother that all of her daughter's expenses would be paid for, the woman cried so hard she couldn't speak. "This is what you did for Timothy," Mr. Harrison told Margaret after that phone call. "You gave him a chance at life. Now we're giving other children a chance at their dreams. Margaret's own daughter, Jessica, was amazed by everything that had happened. When Margaret called to tell her about the scholarship fund, Jessica was quiet for a long time. "Mom, this means I can go to college too, doesn't it?" "Yes, sweetheart. Mr. Harrison has set aside money for your education. You can study whatever you want, wherever you want." Jessica started crying over the phone. "Mom, you saved a little boy's life, and now he's saving our whole future." But not everyone was happy about the changes. Mrs. Harrison's friends stopped calling Margaret by her name and started referring to her as "that woman" when they thought she couldn't hear. Some of Mr. Harrison's business associates were uncomfortable with the situation and started avoiding social events at the Harrison house. Mr. Harrison lost several important business deals because people didn't want to work with someone who had lost his mind over a housekeeper. Margaret heard him on the phone one day, arguing with a longtime business partner who was threatening to end their relationship. "If that's how you feel, then we don't need to work together anymore," Mr. Harrison said calmly. "I'd rather do business with people who judge others by their character, not their bank account." After he hung up, Margaret found him in his office looking tired and stressed. "Sir, I'm causing problems for you. Maybe we should reconsider some of these changes." Mr. Harrison looked up at her with surprise. "Margaret, do you know what I was doing when Timothy was fighting for his life?" Margaret shook her head. "I was in a conference room in London, arguing about profit margins on a deal that would have made me a few $1,000,000 more. A few $1,000,000 that I don't even need. Meanwhile, my son was dying, and the only person who cared enough to save him was someone I had been treating like she was invisible." He stood up and walked to the window that looked out over the backyard where Timothy was playing. "I've made a lot of money in my life, Margaret, but I've never done anything that mattered as much as what you did for Timothy. If some people don't understand that, then they're not the kind of people I want in my life anyway." As the months passed, Margaret watched Timothy grow stronger and happier. He started calling her Aunt Margaret and would run to her first whenever he had exciting news to share. She helped him with his homework, took him to doctor appointments, and tucked him into bed every night. Mr. Harrison began spending more time at home and less time traveling for business. He said he wanted to be the kind of father that Timothy deserved, and he asked Margaret to teach him how to really take care of his son. "You know what Timothy needs better than anyone," he told her. "Help me learn how to be a good dad." Margaret showed Mr. Harrison how to make Timothy's favorite breakfast, how to calm him down when he had bad dreams, and how to listen when Timothy wanted to talk about his day. She watched as the relationship between father and son grew stronger every week. The scholarship foundation grew too. By the end of the first year, they were helping 50 families send their children to college. Margaret traveled to schools and community centers, meeting with parents and students who needed help. She became known in their city as someone who had started with nothing and had dedicated her life to helping others. Mrs. Harrison never did come home. After 6 months at her sister's house, she filed for divorce. Mr. Harrison didn't fight it. He said he realized they had never really been partners anyway, just two people living in the same house with completely different values. "I want Timothy to grow up understanding that a person's worth has nothing to do with how much money they have," he told Margaret. "I want him to know that the most important thing in life is caring about other people." Timothy was 7 years old when he asked Margaret if she would always live with them. "I hope so, sweetheart," she said. "As long as you and your dad want me here." "We'll always want you here," Timothy said seriously. "You're the most important person in our family." Margaret looked around the beautiful house that had become her real home, thought about Jessica in college studying to become a teacher, and remembered all the families they were helping through the scholarship program. She had started as a housekeeper, just trying to earn enough money to survive. Now she was part of a family that was changing lives every day. Sometimes the most extraordinary transformations begin with the simplest act of love.